I'll just quickly run through. I think if people haven't attended a Leeds Civic Trust event before, welcome to you all. Nice to see you here. I hope you've used Zoom before, but if not, it's quite straightforward, and hopefully you can see our faces now. During the evening, when Bob and Jackie are talking, you can submit any questions you like via the chat button. I'll be here just having a look at that, and at the end of the talk, we'll field them. We'll just try and summarise a few of them and get some answers at the end. But yeah, feel free to submit questions there or have a chat amongst yourselves as well. Just before we make a proper start, I'll do the shameless plug at this very moment. But obviously this talk is about Leonora Cohen, who has got a blue plaque, which is one of the things that the Leeds Civic Trust does in the City of Leeds. And we're really proud to say that we've just published this new publication, and it's by Dr. Kevin Grady and Robert Tyrrell. Dr. Grady was our director for 30 years, some of you may know him. And Bob Tyrrell is a member of our Blue Plaques Committee, and they've spent many years producing this book. Obviously, Leonora features, as does Mary Gawthorpe. I don't know if you can catch that, but there's also a lot of other inspirational women, such as Ellen Heaton, Beryl Burton, Gertrude Paul, Isabella Ford, Alice Bacon. So I'm sort of thinking, if you've got granddaughters or children or anybody that you think, oh, they'd love to be inspired, I think this book would be fantastic. It's available at Philip Howard Bookshop in Roundhay if you're out and about, but it's also available via the Trust website. So if you're looking for last minute stocking fillers, it's worth a look. So on to tonight's talk, and we're delighted to have with us Bob and Jackie. They're from the East Leeds, hold on, I made the proper note of it, Historical and Archaeology Society. And, oops, sorry, I was giving me a ring. And I don't know if you tuned into their talk early in September. That was about Montague Burton, and it was very well attended and very well received. It's available still to watch if you didn't catch it, but I'm sure everybody that did attend that one will know that they're in for another treat tonight. What the format will be is I'll just hand over to Bob and Jackie a little just now. They'll present their talk, and then we'll field some questions at the end. So thank you very much to you both for attending tonight. Are you okay to make a start?
Indeed we are. Yeah. Thank you very much, Mel.
Are you all right with the screen share and everything? It should be good to go.
Can you screen share now?
Yeah.
There we go.
Perfect.
Right. Good evening, everybody, and thank you to the Civic Trust for asking us to do this talk tonight. Before I start, I just have a couple of acknowledgements. We've got some photographs in the presentation. Some are from the collection from Leeds Museums and Galleries, and a couple are from Leeds Civic Trust. So thank you to both of those organisations for allowing us to use the photographs. So tonight we're going to look at the life of the Leeds Suffragette Leonora Cohen, who was known as the Tower Suffragette. And until a few years ago, I didn't really know very much about Leonora Cohen, beyond the fact that she was a suffragette. That was really the extent of my knowledge. But I was leafing through a book in the library one day, the A to Z of Local History by John Gilligan, and I came across the entry for Leonora Cohen. And it was only 2 or 3 sentences, a very short paragraph. But it was enough to make me feel that I wanted to know more about her. So I read a couple of books and I did a bit of digging, and I got to know more about her life and what she'd achieved. And it didn't make me an expert on Leonora Cohen, please don't think I am. But I was so intrigued by everything that she'd done. I was amazed, really, to be perfectly honest. And beyond amazed, I was a bit ashamed, because I thought, I'm from Leeds, I'm Leeds born and bred, and yet I knew next to nothing about this iconic lady from the 20th century, and I should have done. And I also felt that, other people should get to know about her, because perhaps she's not given the recognition that she deserves. So I'm really pleased that the Civic Trust has put a blue blue plaque up in her honour in 2007. And I'm delighted that so many of you have logged on tonight, and hopefully by the end of this evening, somebody, you will know a little bit more about her as well. So, Leonora Cohen, OBE, was a famous suffragette born in Hunslet in Leeds. The fact that she lived to be 105 would be notable in itself. But when you look at her life and what else she achieved and what else she did, and the things that she had to put up with because of her political beliefs, she becomes not just notable, she becomes remarkable. This was a lady who was born in the Victorian era, came to prominence in George V's reign, and was still actively involved in her community 15 years after our own Queen came to the throne. So she actually lived through the reign of 6 monarchs: Queen Victoria, Edward VII, George V, Edward VIII very briefly, George VI, and our own Queen Elizabeth. Leonora Throp was born in Hunslet on the 15th of June, 1837. Sorry, 1873. Her father was Canover Throp, a stonemason and sculptor, and her mother was Jane Lammy. Canover and Jane were married in Belfast, Northern Ireland in 1870. On the 1871 census, 2 years before Leonora was born, the couple were living at 46 Burton Street, Hunslet. And here's the 1871 census, which shows us that. So I've made the assumption that they were still living there a couple of years later when Leonora was actually born. And this is in fact Burton Street in Hunslet with 46 our road. This is the baptismal record for Leonora. She was baptised at St Luke the Evangelist Church, Beeston Hill, on the 9th of August 1874. And you'll see here on the baptismal certificate that her father, Canover, is listed as a sculptor. Leonora's grandfather was John Throp, and he was also a stonemason and sculptor from Liverpool. And he was responsible for carving the font at Christ Church, Meadow Lane in Leeds. 4 of John's children were the first to be baptised in it, including Leonora's father, Canover. And this is a rather lovely painting of Leonora when she was aged 5, and it was painted by her father, Canover. Now, her father was actually quite an ill man. He suffered from tuberculosis of the spine, and sadly he died when Leonora was only 5 years old. So this is probably the last painting that he did of her. During the last few years of his life, he was actually confined to bed. But in order to support his family, he did some painting, and he called these paintings that he was doing chocolate box pictures. But they were a way of providing an income and supporting his family. But he did do much more significant work as a stonemason and a sculptor earlier in his life when he was able to, when his health permitted that. And this is one of the buildings that he worked on with his father. This is the Royal Exchange Building, an insurance company, which was in City Square. It opened in 1875 and demolished in May of 1964. So some of you may remember this building. I certainly remember it. So it was a very ornate building with a lot of quite fancy sculpture on it. And he worked on it with his father. There were 2 panels somewhere on the building, which I don't recall, but there were 2 panels on the building which Canover actually sculpted, and they showed the market on Leeds Bridge and the storming of Leeds Castle. And there were also several statues in niches around the building. When the building was demolished, some of it was saved, some of the statues were saved, but nobody seems to know what happened to these friezes that Leonora's father worked on. And in fact, in 1968, Leonora herself tried to find out what had happened to them, but she didn't have any success. And actually, when I was doing the research for this Leonora talk and article that I once wrote, I wrote to the council, and I wrote to the art gallery, and I wrote to Leeds College of Art to see if anybody knew anything about them, but nobody knew where they'd gone. So as I've said, this building had quite a lot of ornate sculpture and statues in it, and so the statues depicted significant Leeds people. So people like Ilbert de Lacy, Sir John Savile, John Harrison, and the founder of the Royal Exchange Building Insurance Company, Sir Thomas Gresham. And as I've said, some of the statues were actually rescued when the building was demolished, and they went into storage by Leeds Museums and Galleries. And we've got a picture of a couple of the statues here in storage, but I don't know whether they are still available, but whether they're long gone, I don't know. After Canova's death, Leonora's mother was left to bring up the 3 children on her own, Leonora and her 2 brothers, and they had to move. They had to move from where they were living, and they moved nearer to the city centre. So this is the 1881 census, which shows Leonora and her mother and her 2 brothers, John and Francis, living at 12 Blundell Street in Leeds. So Jane had been left to bring up the children on her own, which was a hard life for her. And so she had to go back to her original occupation of being a seamstress. And she worked from home. She was an outworker, she worked from home. Leonora spent a lot of time at home, actually, being homeschooled by her mother, because she was quite a frail child. She also had tuberculosis, so she didn't have very much official schooling. She was mostly schooled at home by her mum, and she helped out with the sewing actually as well. Her mother, as I say, took him out working, making things like sailor suits, and Leonora helped with sewing the emblems on them, anchors and crowns and things like that. But it was a hard life, not an easy life. And Leonora's mother often used to say, "Leonora, if only we women had a say in things." Leonora wanted to do something about it. She said, "A drunken lout of a man opposite had the vote simply because he was male. I vowed to try to change things. I felt it in my bones." And so the seeds were sown for her later militant action in the suffragette fight. By 1891, the family had moved again, and they're now living at 1 Budgefield Terrace in Leeds. Leonora left school at about the age of 14, and she became an apprentice to a fashionable milliner in the town, in the centre. She became a probationer, and she had to work unpaid for the first year. She had to work unpaid for the first year, after which she became a probationer, and she earned 2 6 a week, 12.5 pence a week as a probationer. By the time she was 16, she'd been promoted to head milliner, and she earned 16 shillings a week, or 80 pence. Eventually, having been promoted and moved jobs, she did actually manage to get a salary of £80 a year, which was quite good actually in those days. In her mid-20s, she moved to Bridlington to become a millinery buyer, and by this time she'd met her future husband, Henry Cohen. So Leonora married Henry Cohen in Bridlington in 1900, and on the 1901 census, they're living at 52 Brownhill Crescent, Leeds, with their 4-month-old daughter, Rosetta. Henry was the son of a significant Jewish family, and he had a business as a jeweller and watchmaker in the town. Nobody from either family attended the wedding because neither family approved of it. They didn't approve of the match. It was a mixed marriage, Jew and Gentile, and I suppose in those days it was probably less common than it is now. So certainly Henry's family did not approve, and in fact they cut all ties with Henry. They cut him off completely. Leonora's mother while she had nothing against Henry as a person, she didn't think that Leonora should be getting married at all. She felt that Leonora shouldn't be taking on the responsibilities of marriage and the family, but she should be doing something for the cause of women. But she did eventually become reconciled to the idea of the marriage. And it was a long and successful marriage and a very happy marriage until Henry's death in 1949. So this is a census showing from 1901, showing the family living at 52 Barnhill Crescent. And you can see that their daughter, Rosetta, is on the census. She's 4 months old. Sadly, she didn't survive until her first birthday. But Leonora did go on to have another child. She had a son, Reginald, and he survived into adulthood. So for the first 8 or 9 years of her marriage, Leonora concentrated on being a wife and her mother. But she never forgot her political leanings, and she was becoming increasingly concerned about the plight of the women working in the sweatshops in the tailoring industry in Leeds, in the sweated labour conditions that they had in the textile industry. So this led to her involvement in the suffragette movement, and she joined the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, in 1909. She came to it quite late, really, because this organisation had been started in 1903 by Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst. There had been for many decades, let alone years, there had been campaigns to give women the vote. And in the late 19th century, it was particularly irksome to women in Britain that they didn't have the vote, because New Zealand and Australia had given women the vote in 1893 and 1894 respectively. But they actually weren't the first places to let women have the vote. That honour actually does go to the Isle of Man, because the Isle of Man allowed women to vote in the Time World in 1881. But they never get the recognition for being the first place to let women have the vote, because they never legislated for it. They never passed a law to say women could have the vote. They simply let it happen. So the women in Britain were campaigning to have the vote, and there were two factions of women, mainly women, who were campaigning for the vote. They were the Suffragists and the Suffragettes. Now, the Suffragists were not into civil disobedience. They were a peaceful movement, and they were only campaigning by peaceful methods. So writing letters and perhaps holding meetings and processions, but they didn't get involved in any militant action, unlike the Suffragettes, who really felt that actions and militancy was the only way that they were going to get their voice heard. Leonora became secretary of the Leeds branch of the WSPU, and she also joined an elite branch within the organisation of women who were bodyguards for Emmeline Pankhurst. Now, the suffragettes were not universally liked, even by other women. A lot of people simply did not support the movement, and they had to put up with have stones thrown at them, sticks thrown at them when they were holding marches or rallies. So when Leonora was at a rally, and particularly when she was acting as bodyguard for Emmeline Pankhurst, she used to wrap corrugated cardboard underneath her clothes to protect herself from the stones. And this is the 1911 census, and it actually shows Leonora, her husband Henry, and her son Reginald all living in Skegness. In this year, 1911, she went to London to attend a WSPU meeting at Caxton Hall, and was part of a deputation to Parliament with a resolution demanding equal franchise rights for men and women. A confrontation occurred after this meeting, and many women, including Leonora, were involved in stone throwing and window smashing. Now, there seems to be two versions of the events that day as far as Leonora was concerned. one version is that she threw the stone in self-defense, and the other version is that she threw the stone as an act of disobedience, as a militant action. So whichever way it was, she was arrested and she appeared before the magistrate. Now, Leonora said, firstly, she said that throwing stones at government buildings was not a malicious act in any case, but she also said that she had thrown the stone because she was in fear of her life. She threw it in self-defense because she thought that she was going to be trodden underfoot by the police horses. The magistrate didn't accept that version of events, and she was sentenced to 7 days in Holloway. Leonora didn't actually want to get involved really in the militant side of things. It frightened her. She didn't like it at all. She did it, but she didn't really like it. And in fact, in an interview that she gave in 1974, she actually said, "When I had to do militancy, I nearly died of fright because I hated anything that was, well, anything to do with confrontation." And this is a copy of the bail bond showing that Leonora was imprisoned for 7 days in Holloway in 1911. So after this event, Leonora returned home to her husband, Henry, who was very supportive of her. He was very supportive of the whole movement, and he was certainly very much supportive of Leonora. But his friends and his colleagues were perhaps not so supportive. And in fact, one of his friends said to him, "If I had a wife like Leonora, I would tie her to the table leg so she couldn't get about to take part in any more escapades." And Leonora also found that her own friends deserted her. A lot of her own friends didn't agree with what she was doing, and so they ostracized her. And in fact, she said her name was Mud. And she did receive hate mail, and also her son, Reginald, was bullied at school because of her actions. But this didn't dampen her spirits at all, and she continued to be very active in the movement, addressing open-air meetings, selling the Suffragette newspaper outside chapels and on the steps of the town hall. She generally took her son Reginald with her when she was doing this. She also took part in the 1912 London Smash campaign, but she didn't get arrested at that time. But it was in 1913, early 1913, when she really hit the headlines. She was part of a deputation to London and addressed the Prime Minister about the plight of the women in the Leeds textile industry, the Leeds tailoresses. And in a speech she made, she explained that the tailoresses worked for 3p halfpenny an hour, while the male tailors were getting 6p halfpenny for the same work. She said, "In slack time, the girls go day after day to the factory, but get no work given them. A haunted look comes over their faces as they realise they are being driven onto the streets. Raise their status, Mr. Lloyd George. Help them get rid of that haunted look." But the Reform Bill and the amendment in support of women's suffrage was thrown out. And this absolutely incensed the suffragettes, and they decided to take militant action. Now, initially, Leonora volunteered to be part of the stone throwing brigade, but then she changed her mind about that because she didn't really feel that damaging private property was the right course of action. It wasn't the right way to go. So she stayed on in London for a couple of days, and she got hold of a tourist guide. And having read it, she decided that she was going to stage a protest at the Tower of London. So she took 3 iron bars from a fire grate and she filed them down, and with one of these under her coat, plus some other implements, she took the tube to the tower. And I'll read you Leonora's own words of what happened next. "I caught the underground to Mark Lane, but I was so frightened I couldn't get out. I had to go round again. I got out the second time and staggered up to the tower. I was fortunate to see a crocodile line of schoolboys weaving its way to the tower. I joined them at the back, making people think I was a teacher. Then we got to the jewel house. I saw my chance and threw the bar at the glass case and it smashed. The beefeaters grabbed me and I was put in one of the dungeons, then taken to a police station. It was horrible, really. Now, the case she'd smashed, I mean, it didn't actually contain the crown jewels, although some of the newspaper headlines did say that. But it contained a decoration for the Order of Merit. Leonora appeared before the magistrates on the same day, and the charge against her was that she, within County of London, unlawfully and maliciously, did commit damage to certain public property. To wit, did break a glass showcase at the Tower of London, the damage being an amount exceeding £5, to wit, £7. Now that £7 is significant, so remember the £7. Before she'd thrown the iron bar, she'd actually written a label explaining her intentions. And the label read, it was written on both sides, and it read, "Votes for women. 100 years of constitutional petition, resolutions, meetings and processions have failed. Jewel House, Tower of London. My protest to the government for its refusal to enfranchise women, but continues to torture women prisoners," because that was a reference to the force feeding. "Deeds, not words. Leonora Cohen." So the magistrate decided that because the value of the damage she'd caused to the case was more than £5, she couldn't be tried in the magistrate's court, and they decided to send her to Crown Court to be tried by a judge and jury. And this is where her husband came to her rescue, because if you remember, Henry had a jewellery business in town. So he got a defence witness for her who was a cabinet maker to the jewellery trade. And this man said that the value of the repair was not more than £5. It wasn't £7. It was £4.10. And he would be happy to do the work for £4.10. Leonora then said to the court that if that was the case, they didn't have any jurisdiction over her because the damage was less than £5. The jury couldn't come to an agreement as to what the value of the damage might be, and so the judge had no option but to dismiss the case. And so Leonora returned home to Leeds, the subject of much press coverage. Now, this is one of the photographs that's from the collection of Leeds Museums and Galleries. It's held at Harry House Museum. So she continued, and she continued to be very active. In March of that year, she went on a political rally at Woodhouse Moor, and she followed that up with another rally in April at the East Leeds Miners' Institute. Now, the police were attending both these rallies, and they were taking note of the speech that Leonora gave on both occasions. And she was subsequently arrested for inciting the public to mutiny. George Lansbury, for inciting the public to militancy, militancy, not mutiny, George Lansbury and John Skerr, who was a trade unionist and who were both supporters of the movement, were also arrested about this time. Leonora didn't get sent to prison. She was bound over to keep the peace. And the text under this photograph is Laura's own handwriting. These are her own notes. And it reads, "I, Leonora Cohen, was arrested and charged with inciting the public to militancy under an Edward III Act, a trumped-up false charge, at the same period as George Lansbury and John Skerr. A protest meeting was held in Trafalgar Square, London, for the release of the three charged under this old antediluvian act." And I'm very grateful to Nicola Pullen from Abbey House Museum, creator of Abbey House Museum, because she transcribed the wording for me. I couldn't quite make out all of the words, and she very kindly transcribed it for me. So, as I say, she was still very active. Here we've got a copy of a list from a list of suffragettes who were arrested and imprisoned between the years of 1906 and 1914. And you can see that Leonora Cohen appears 3 times on the list. Other people have been arrested and imprisoned once, but Leonora was arrested and imprisoned 3 times. In November 1913, the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, who was a local man, he came from Morley, was visiting Leeds to address a meeting at the Coliseum Hall. Now, the police had taken steps to ensure that no suffragettes could attend this meeting. They didn't want the suffragettes to be able to attend the meeting and disrupt the meeting. So the suffragettes formed a huge procession and marched to the hall. And the procession was headed up with a banner which said, "Strong reasons make strong actions." And strong actions is what was happening on that day, because at the time that the suffragettes were marching towards the hall, 2 Leeds suffragettes were attempting to set fire to the stand at Headingley Stadium. The suffragettes quite often targeted places that were regarded as the prerogative of males. So quite often sports stadiums and golf links. Golf links were another popular target for the suffragettes. You know, they weren't above to digging up the links, because they felt that these were places that mainly belonged to men, and it was the men who were preventing them getting the vote. After this demonstration, Leonora was arrested for breaking the windows at the Labour Exchange, and she was remanded in custody in Armley Jail until the 3rd of December. She immediately embarked upon not only a hunger strike, but a thirst strike. Now, a thirst strike is extremely dangerous. Apparently, you can survive for, you know, maybe 4 or 5 days without food, but you can't survive beyond that without water or without liquid. So it was extremely dangerous for her to go on to a hunger and thirst strike. And she did become very ill. She wasn't force-fed because of the damage that had been caused to her throat when she had tuberculosis. So she didn't have to suffer that. But as I say, she was extremely ill. And so she was released under the Cat and Mouse Act. The Cat and Mouse Act was what the authorities used when suffragettes became ill in prison because of the treatment they had received, because of either the force feeding or the treatment that they received. A lot of suffragettes in prison became very, very ill, and the authorities released them to go home and recover, and then they had to come back when they were well enough to serve the rest of their sentences. So she was released under the Cat and Mouse Act, but obviously she did expect to be returned to prison at some point. Now, this is when her husband came to her rescue, because he wrote to the Home Office and he said, if she was rearrested and re-imprisoned, he wouldn't accept any responsibility for her, and he wouldn't allow her back into the family home. Really, he was just making sure that the Home Office knew that if anything happened to Leonora, it was going to be their responsibility. And this was only 6 months after Emily Wilde Davis had been killed under the horse's hooves, the hooves of a king's horse at the Derby. And really, the authorities couldn't afford another martyr. So she returned home safely. But somebody had a word in Henry's ear, somebody quite high up in the police force, it's thought, and they suggested that he should get Leonora away from Leeds, get her away from the action. So the family moved to Harrogate, whereupon Leonora, far from fading into the background, immediately joined the WSPU's Harrogate branch. But the family moved to Harrogate, and Leonora opened their home as a guest house. And she was quite forward thinking, because it was a vegetarian guest house. She served vegetarian food, and she baked her own wholemeal bread. So she was a bit of ahead of her time, really, in that respect. And she made her guest house available to other women who were fleeing from the Cat and Mouse Act. And she took care of them, and quite often she helped them to escape. And one particular suffragette whom she helped to escape was a lady called Lillian Lenton. Now, Lillian had already escaped from a house in Leeds, so the police were watching her. They were watching out for her. They knew she was in Harrogate with Leonora, and they were watching out for her. But Leonora helped her escape by dressing her in some clothes that belonged to her son Reggie. And Lillian escaped from the back of the house via the coal cellar, apparently. So this is a photograph, again, from Leonora's scrapbook from Leeds Museums and Galleries. But of course, it's 1914 and World War I breaks out. When this happened, the suffragettes agreed to cease all of their actions for the duration of the war. And in fact, Emmeline Pankhurst came to an agreement with the Prime Minister to say that not only would they cease their actions, but she would actively encourage suffragettes, or women in general, to take part in the war effort. And so Leonora became a munitionette, and she went to work for Leeds Forge. And she was working there when the tragedy happened at Barnbow in 1916, 5th of December 1916, when there was a major explosion at the Barnbow munition factory. And after this, Leonora set up a fund. She set up the Edith Cavell Fund to provide money for operative treatment and surgical appliances for the injured survivors. Edith Cavell, of course, was the British nurse who was shot by the Germans as a spy. This lovely dress was made by Leonora herself, and she wore it to the Leeds Arts Ball in 1914. She was a quite accomplished seamstress, and this dress features a lot of the Leonora, the suffragette emblems. Particularly note the figure in the front of it, she's dressed as a warrior, and because that's what the suffragettes consider themselves, they did consider themselves as warriors. As part of her war effort, Leonora became the only woman member of the Leeds Food Control Committee. She also set up a trades union for the munitions workers, and because of her involvement in the trades unions movement after the war, she was involved in visiting Europe and beyond, investigating post-war industrial conditions in various parts of the world. When the war ended, a small number of women were given the vote. Those aged over 30 who owned property were given the vote, but it was another 10 years, 1928, before women were given the vote on the same conditions as men. So the women have eventually got the vote, but Leonora is still active. In 1922, she visited the Black Forest, where she was reporting on the deprivation that the German people were suffering as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was extremely harsh, and really the German people were starving because in order to make reparation, all of their produce and all of the money that the country had earned had to be given up, so that the people were really starving. And and Leonora noticed this. She noted this, and when she came back home, she said, "I hope I never live to see the day when the working classes of England have to keep their noses to the grindstone, as have the Germans I saw in the Black Forest." In 1923, she became the first woman president of the Leeds Trade and Labour Council. In 1925, she organised a campaign to persuade people to buy British-made matches instead of imported ones. Some years earlier, she had persuaded the local co-op to buy local matches made in Leeds, but now she was extending that to other shops and small tobacconists because the British matchmaking industry was in decline. It was in the doldrums, and the women who worked in it were suffering. So she mounted a campaign to persuade people to buy British in terms of matches. In 1926, she was elected president of the Yorkshire Federation of Trades Council. Again, she was the first woman to hold that post. She was also a district organiser of the National Union of General and Municipal Workers. But despite all of this political activity, she never realised her ambition of becoming a Labour councillor for Leeds. She did try. She tried 3 times. She in 1922, 24 and 26, she stood for election to the council, but she never got elected. She must have run quite a good campaign. You know, here's a copy of an election poster with a photograph on it. So she obviously had the backing of the Labour movement, and there must have been some money behind her campaign. But unfortunately, she wasn't elected. In 1926, she became a magistrate, and this was a post that she held for 30 years. During her time as a magistrate, she regularly visited Army Jail, and when she was there, she saw the logbook, which recorded the fact that she had been allowed out of jail on licence as part of the Cat and Mouse Act. So, and she'd never gone back. But technically, you know, she still had to serve the rest of that sentence, and she could have been recalled to jail at any time. Obviously, she wasn't, but technically, she could have been. She retired her presidency of the Leeds Trade and Labour Council in 1927, and that year she went to Canada to report on opportunities, employment opportunities for young people in Canada. Now, Stanley Baldwin had asked her to go and do this, and he had made a great play of how many opportunities there were in Canada for young people. Leonora was a bit sceptical about this, but she went with an open mind, and she did see that, in fact, there were quite good opportunities for young people in Canada, particularly in domestic service, which in England after the First World War, domestic service was not regarded as it had been before the war. You know, women had a taste of other things working as they did during the war. They'd had a taste of being able to earn more money, and perhaps, you know, the work they do was better regarded than domestic service. So domestic service was, you know, in decline after the First World War, but not so in Canada. And it was more appreciated, and the wages were certainly better. When Leonora came back, she said she was so impressed that she wouldn't hesitate to recommend young people to emigrate to Canada. In 1928, at the age of 55, she was awarded the OBE for services to public life. In the 1930s, she joined the Women's Freedom League, which was still campaigning for women's rights. They'd got the vote, but they were campaigning for women's rights within the workplace and other things, and Leonora wanted to be involved in that. So she did continue with a public life, but much more quietly, and especially after the death of her husband in 1949. Now, this is a lovely picture of Leonora at Abbey House Museum in February of 1966, where they had a Votes for Women exhibition, and Leonora helped to curate this exhibition. And here you can see that she's showing someone the dress that she made and wore to the Leeds Arts Ball in 1914. It was this year, 1966, when she retired to Ross-on-Sea near Colwyn Bay in Wales. But her retirement was really quite short-lived, because even 12 months later, she was still involved in women's rights. You know, and in 1968, she helped out with the plans to commemorate the 50 years of women getting the vote. And this is a picture, copy of the front of the Radio Times from 1970, when she travelled to London for the unveiling of a memorial of all who'd worked for women's suffrage. The memorial is sited in the public gardens of Christchurch in Victoria Street, close to the Caxton Hall, which was quite appropriate because a lot of the suffragette activities took place in Caxton Hall. On her 100th birthday, she gave a speech where she said, "One hopes that women of the future will organise themselves into groups or unions, and that they will use the vote intelligently to ensure that we will have the very highest standards of womanhood." She wasn't really that much enamoured of the feminists of the 1970s, the bra burning brigade. She didn't think that was feminine at all, actually, but she did support their ideals, you know, rights for women, rights in the workplace, rights in the home, and so on. This is a copy of the Wspu badge, which Leonora wore, which she was very proud to wear whenever she was involved in suffragette activities. This is the Hunger Strike Medal. All suffragettes who went on hunger strike were awarded this medal. You can see that the ribbon is the suffragette colours, green, white and purple, and it is inscribed "For Valour." This is the Holloway brooch, designed by Sylvia Pankhurst, and that was awarded to WSP members who've been imprisoned. And so Leonora obviously got it because she was imprisoned 3 times in Holloway as well. And this was described as the Victoria Cross of the Union. And here we've got a lovely photograph of the blue plaque that was installed by the Leeds Civic Trust in June 2007 at Claremont Villas, where she and her husband lived. So the unveiling was done by Michael Meadowcroft, who former Liberal MP for Leeds and a local historian. Michael actually met Leonora. He travelled to Ross-on-Sea to interview her, and the lady in the picture is Veronica Lovell, and she was instrumental in arranging the funds so that the plaque could be installed. You can't read the contents of the plaque here on this photograph, but we have got another photograph showing you close-up of the plaque, and it says Leonora Cohen, JP OBE, leading suffragette famous for smashing a showcase in the Jewel House at the Tower of London and for her hunger strike at Armley Jail in 1913. Lived here 1923 to 1936. And here's a lovely photograph of Leonora in her later years. This was taken in the 1970s. She was 105 years old in June 1978, and she insisted on being out of bed to greet the numbers of reporters and photographers who came to meet her on that day. And she even had her first sip of champagne on that day, on her birthday. Leonora died peacefully in her sleep on the 5th of September 1978. There can be no more fitting tribute to this remarkable lady than the words her husband Henry wrote in his will. "I desire to leave her my assurance that I have lived in perfect appreciation of all her loving and unselfish devotion throughout our happy life together. My love for her has been the one perfect happiness that life has given to me, and I leave my son, Reginald Fox Cohen of Otley Road, Leeds, the solemn duty of taking my place to make her declining years as happy and comfortable as she deserves of us both. Thank you."
No, thank you, Jackie. That was really lovely. I think what we can all take from that discussion is just how indebted we are to women like Leonora, just their courage and bravery, really, and what they've done for us, and you know what they've secured for us. I've got a few questions if you're happy to answer them, Jackie.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert.
Oh, well, let's give it a go. But it'd be interesting to see your thoughts on these. I just was wondering if she had any connections with Mary Gawthorpe or Isabella Ford.
But she was certainly involved in the strike, you know, in the fight for the women's suffrage at the same time as they were. Yes, so I suppose she did. Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, it's just such a curious thing that you know, for long periods of her life, she was quite anti-authority, probably, you know, through the circumstances, but to then become a magistrate and an OBE, what was that quite unusual, or do you think?
It was quite unusual to be a female magistrate at that time. You know, she was one of the first. Yes.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I suppose she, you know, the recognition she got was probably in spite of the fact that she was a woman, rather than because she was a woman.
Do you think if she was living today, that she would have gone into politics in a more formal way?
I think she would have. Yeah, I mean, you know, it was a source of sorrow to her, really, that she didn't become a councillor. You know, she really wanted to be a Leeds councillor, but it, you know, it didn't happen.
And it's interesting, you know, how special her relationship with her husband was, and how supportive he was, and it sounds like he got her out of a few scrapes as well.
Yeah, he was very supportive of her, definitely. Yeah.
So we've had a few more questions in. I'll just have a quick check of those. Oh, Meryl's asking, do we know what happened to her son? Does he did he continue to live in Leeds, and does he have a family?
I don't actually know what happened to him, but I was talking to someone a couple of years ago, and she said that her next door neighbour was, wait a minute, was the father-in-law of Leonora's granddaughter, I think. So obviously there was, you know, he did stay and he did come in, but I don't know the details at all. That's all I know, that someone lived next door to someone who was the father-in-law of her granddaughter.
And I just think to what inspires you about Leonora, Jackie?
Well, as I say, I mean, I don't count myself as a feminist, but I do support women's rights, and and it was that really that because she wasn't just a suffragette, you know, it was the whole picture. You know, she wanted to support women in many ways, you know, in employment and within the home and things like that. And she was such a forward thinker. She was so much ahead of her time, really. And that's what appealed to me.
Yeah, she seems very much about any sort of inequality or injustice, that she wanted to speak up about it, and I think that's quite inspiring. Yeah. We've had somebody say, what about a statue to recognise Leonora's work? Would you be in support of that?
Yes, I would. Is there a movement to put a statue to a woman in Leeds? And I believe Leonora Cohen is one of the people who was suggested, actually.
Yeah, I think she could be named on a statue.
Yes. Are there going to be ribbons with all of the names?
Yes, that's the one. Yeah, that would be. I think it will be on Quarry Hill, hopefully soon. But I think a standalone one. I mean, just the longevity of her life and her contribution to Leeds is quite incredible. Yeah, I'd just like to say thank you to you both. To Bob, who's hidden away. Excellent skills on the PowerPoint there, Bob, and thank you so much, Jackie. It's been a really informative talk. I'd just like to let everybody know about a talk we've got coming up next Thursday. So we're fast forwarding a little bit from suffragettes to the Leeds of the 1970s, if anybody's got any interest in that. It's a look at architecture and the city's infrastructure, and should be a really interesting talk. We've got John Grindrod, who's a social historian, as part of the panel, and also Elaine Harwood, who's a post-war architectural specialist. So that promises to be quite good. We can send you all information about that following this talk if you're interested. But for now, again, I'd just like to thank you both. And if anybody missed out on anything, didn't quite, you know, your internet cut out or anything happened, we have recorded tonight's discussion, so we can pop that on our website, and you're more than welcome to listen to it again. But for now, thank you ever so much, and good night. Do you want to say good night?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for all the comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.